welcome back to the workshop. Now, you may remember that last week I accepted the challenge of trying to get my mate John's Range Rover through an MOT. Now, obviously, before I can do that, I need to get it to run. I've done a number of checks, and now the next thing I need to try and work out is why the fuel pump doesn't seem to be working. So maybe what I'll do, I'll just have a quick check to make sure things like fuses and stuff aren't blown or missing or anything. Right, so let's have a look. So our fuse box is right here. In fact, the cover is here, so clearly John's been having a little fiddle with this earlier sometime. So you can see there, so the fuel fuse is number 18, which is the third in from the end. So 1, 2, 3, it's the one that's missing. It's red because it's 10 amps. And just looking at that, it looks to me as if that filament is fine. So let's pop that in. I can't imagine for a second it's going to be this easy. Let's try it again. Still pretty sure I can't hear anything. I might just crack off the hose in the engine bay just to make sure there isn't anything coming out. Right, so I've got a screwdriver. My cunning plan is just to undo this Jubilee clip at the top here of this hose. Now, this hose is connected to the high pressure fuel line, and it's going to basically a sensor. It's like a fuel pressure sensor. So what I'm hoping is if I can crack this off, what'll happen is the fuel will try to escape if it's actually coming out at all. Oops. There we go. So now, theoretically, we should see some fuel come out of there if there is a fuel pump. So I'm just going to crank it over again, see what happens. Well, still no joy, unfortunately. Still no sign of any fuel coming out of our hose here. But also, I still can't hear that fuel pump, and that's really bothering me. And even though I did a visual check on the fuse, I haven't actually checked to see if there's any voltage there. So I think maybe I'll do that next. Right, so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to use the cigarette lighter as my earth, because obviously the shield on the outside there is going to earth. And just to check that, just turn the ignition on. Right, so cool. So we've got, so with no ignition, if we go onto our fuel pump fuse, we've got, actually we've got nothing on ignition. But when I'm cranking over, we have got about nearly 7 volts. I'm just going to try lower down. Yep. So, okay, so the fuse works on either side, which is all good. And we've got nearly 7 volts going to the fuel pump. Now, it's not really enough, it should be more like 12, but of course, again, we know the battery isn't quite up to scratch and also not quite up to full charge. But the main thing is we have power there. So I still can't hear it go, so perhaps the next thing to do is to check to see whether there's any power going to the pump itself. Now, to be able to check the power getting to the fuel pump, I need to find the fuel pump. Now, first up, you can see there's a little sort of cylinder on the side of the tank here. Now, obviously, that looks a little bit like a fuel pump, but actually, it's a fuel filter. You can see the fuel line going in and out, and there are no wires attached to that. And you can see that this fuel line here actually goes in sort of over on the other side. If I just check on this side, right, yes, I can now see that fuel line coming all the way around and going in sort of to the front edge, or just on the top edge of that tank. Now, also you can see here there's a swirl pot, if you like, that little dimple on the bottom of the tank. You've got this protective shield here, but just inside that is a swirl pot, and that is basically where the fuel pump sort of sits in the tank, and then it scavenges the fuel from that low point, so it's always getting sort of the best chance of getting some fuel into the engine. So that means that the fuel pump is actually sitting inside the tank. So to actually get to it, I need to take the tank out. Of course, I've just filled up with nice low fuel, so that's a bit of a pain. But there is a wire here. If I follow this round, it comes to here. And some of these wires should be actually plugged into the fuel level sender. So it's like a little sort of a float like you'd have in a cistern in a toilet, and basically it's just going to be bobbing up and down, and then that resistance coming out of that is actually going to be telling the fuel gauge how much fuel we've got. So although it should be connected, it doesn't really affect the fact that obviously we haven't got any fuel coming out of our pump. So what I can try, bear in mind that I need the ignition on for it all to work, is I can actually just try putting some power into the pump and see if I can spin it up directly with 12 volts. Now obviously I'm going to have to add reconnecting the fuel cylinder to the list, but in the meantime, if I just disconnect this fuel pump connector. Now, if I connect up and earth in 12 volts into that, theoretically, I definitely then will know for sure that the pump has got some power. And then, hopefully, if I tap it while it's going, it might actually spin up, might be able to coax it into life. So we'll see what happens. Right, so what I'm going to do here, I'm using a battery charger to give me a constant 12 volt feed, so I know that I've got the right amount of voltage. I'm just going to set my CTEC here to supply. And I'm then going to connect that up to my power probe. So I've now got that is nice and wide awake, and I've got, it's like a little bradawl or a pick, and I'm going to connect my earth to that so I can then connect it into the socket on our pump. So I've got my CTEC battery charger on supply, so I'm getting a definite, like a fully charged battery's worth of voltage. I'm just going to put this little pick or bradawl up into the terminal, connect the earth to that side, and then do the same thing with my probe on the other side. So I've got continuity there, which means because of the coil, it's basically measuring that continuity, that resistance. It's quite low resistance because it's a motor. So if I now do that and then push the little button up, I'm now sending 12 volts to that. So theoretically, if it was going to spin, it would do it now. It's actually quite difficult with that beep. What I might do, I might just do this directly to the battery charger so that I can see if I've actually got some power while there's no noise going on. So I'm just going to undo that, and then, so I'm still on supply. Now, so again, I'll connect that into there like so. So I've now got 12 volts going to the pump again. Still can't hear anything, but I'm now going to try and tap it with a hammer, just in case it kind of wakes it up. And obviously I can't get to the pump, but I can get to near where the pump is. I can hear the metal ringing, but I can't hear any pump noises. So I think probably our pump may have seized, but the only way to really know for sure is to get inside the tank and take the pump out. To do that, I'll need to drop it first. And because these bolts, like everything else in this car, have been sat for a long time just rusting away, first of all, I'm going to stick some penetrating fluid on there to get some XCP on there. And then on a little trick to try and clean those threads to make it a bit easier to undo. Well, the XCP is doing its magic for a while now. Interestingly, the bolts that hold the front of the tank on look newer than the ones on the rear. So I think they're going to undo relatively easily. But if you look at the ones on the back here, you can see they are quite corroded. Now, I think it's actually a bolt and a nut rather than sort of some kind of captive stud. And there's a lot of mud up here, but I think I can feel a head. So I should be able to get a spanner on that. So theoretically, I could just shear them off and then replace them. But it's an interesting point that when a stud is looking this rusty, rather than just undoing it, which of course you could do, it might actually pay sometimes to kind of clear the thread a little bit first. And by cleaning that thread, it's going to make it much easier and hopefully going to stop the nut sort of seizing halfway down. And there's a couple of ways of doing that. Right, so if you can imagine this is our rusty bolt with our rusty threads that needs to be cleaned. Now the first thing to do, if you happen to have a tap and die set, very simple, and nowadays you can get them, or get cheap ones relatively reasonably, you get the die for the right size, and you can see that it's a special tool that's designed for cutting thread out of a solid rod. So Obviously it's quite sharp, and it's exactly the right, precise sort of precision bit of engineering to actually go and cut the thread. It's also got a little tapered opening, if you like, to help get onto that rod, which is ideal for getting onto your slightly rusty sort of stud, if you like. So you basically have to be very careful as you ease it on, and of course then you can open it and close it, and if it's a good quality die, you'll actually have a slot in there so you can wind in the sort of nut on the outside, and that'll open or close the thread to make it a tighter sort of cut. So that's the first thing, but obviously as you can see, if you've got one of these sort of holders, it's going to be very difficult to use that in that confined space. So the next thing to have a look at is a rethreading tool, a rethreading kit. Now with a kit like this, you have all kinds of different thread sizes you can use, but also you often have these rethreading files. Now if you actually look at, if I can find the right pitch, so you have different pitches on each face and at either end, and then this is the pitch I need for this particular stud, and you can actually see if you look closely, you've got cleaning slots going horizontally and cutting teeth going vertically. So you can actually use it to clean your threads out quite nicely. So you can see that you can just clean your threads much the same way you could with the die, but you can get into much more difficult spaces. Right, the next thing, if that doesn't work, you have these special rethreading nuts. Now again with the nut, you can see it's much like the die, you've got these sort of threaded parts inside there, but also got these little slots, and again, that's where the rust or the dirt or whatever that's in the way on the thread is going to get sort of sent out. So again, you can pop that on and you wind it in position and again, and clean your thread. Now, if you haven't got either of those things and you're still a bit stuck, you could just use a standard nut, or in this case, actually, a little nylock. So it's got the nylon on there, it doesn't really matter. What I can then do is I'm just going to pop that into either a pair of moles. In this case, you could just do a vise if you happen to have one close to hand. What I'm going to do then is I'm actually going to cut a slot with an angle grinder, the cutting disc, or a hacksaw for that matter. You can actually cut that slot, and then once you've got that slot, it works much the same way as this. You're going to have that kind of leading edge which can then scrape away any of the rust on your thread. So I'm just going to cut that so you can do a bit of an experiment. So I've just got like a little tiny cut in the thread there. And now, just to show that it works, I'm just going to pop it off and give it a go. That's good, and just wash it off again, so make sure there's no particles there. So now I can't really put it off any longer, I'm going to have to actually undo them. I'm going to use an impact driver just to give me a really fighting chance. Oh, that's definitely worked. Oh, okay. So there's a lot of stuff coming out of here, but that side's off, and of course now, thankfully, the tank is just resting on the tow bar, so it might be the case that I'm not going to ease it out, otherwise it's actually doing me a favour right now. And because I've still got fuel in here, it's going to be a little heavier than it might have been, so I'm just going to support the weight on the toolbox. Wonderful. Just undoing the breather for the tank. This is mainly used when you're filling up, but lets the air escape as you're replacing that volume with fuel. There's quite a lot of mud down here. Well, the last thing I'm trying to disconnect here is the fuel filler. And I think it's a big old pipe, but that Jubilee clip has definitely seen better days. Right, so it should pretty much just drop off. I'm still going to have to disconnect, obviously, the fuel line from the filter, but I'm hoping There we go. Oh, there we are. Right, so we have landed. So now if I lift the car up, the tank will go with it, and hopefully I'll get enough room just to get to the pipe to disconnect it from the filter. We're so close, but being lazy isn't helping because now the other end of that hose, or the filler hose or pipe, is in the way. So I think I'm going to have to disconnect that as well. Well, it's definitely fighting me, that's for sure. I'm trying to get it out without having to remove the tow bar, but I have a horrible feeling that it's going to have to come out too. Done. Right, well, with the tank now on the bench, I can actually see our fuel pump finally. You can see it has seen better days. There's dirt over it. I can't quite see where our screwdriver is going to go to undo the screws. It needs a good clean, and also the Jubilee clips are very rusty. You need to get some penetrating fluid on those as well to get those off. I mean, otherwise, the general conditions are kind of like okay. John did say he'd actually bought a new tank some time ago. I'm suggesting perhaps it was even longer than he remembers. Or certainly he didn't paint the top half. The bottom was nicely red oxided. The top is looking quite rusty, but I think it's still intact, so we might be able to rescue it, which is great. Also, the steel pipe here looks a bit rusty, but I think again it's probably intact. But again, we'll have a look at that a little bit later on. But really, the next thing is to clean all this up and then get in there and actually get that pump out of the tank. So this fuel line is fighting me a little bit. Again, as always, just get the pick in there and relieve as much as you can. Hopefully, I've got a bit more leverage here anyway. So then I can get to the final screw. Finally get to see the state of our fuel pump. Oh my word, it's looking quite corroded in places. So you can see the aluminium bit is fine. All the steel stuff has got very rusty, so there's obviously been lots of moisture in the tank as we suspected before. You can see this is the little sort of filter, almost like a little bag, and that's where the fuel goes in, and that stops any sort of rust that's already in the tank going into, like the first stage, if you like, going into the fuel here. And obviously the filter on the outside is what then filters that further before it goes to the engine and the injectors. Now, what would be great is just to see if it could be made to work with a bit of a tap perhaps, but obviously if the outside steel bits are rusty, chances are if there's any steel inside the pump, that might also be in the same sort of state. But we'll take it away from this big volume of explosive gas and put it over there and just try and give it a go. Right, so my cunning plan is just to now connect our battery supply, our 12 volts, to this pump. I'm kind of hoping, I'm pretty sure nothing's going to happen, but we just thought to give it a go. Now you can see, I think it's pretty much seized, but while it's now connected up, it's got 12 volts. Now I'm hoping just tapping it might be enough to spin it around. Mostly all that's happening is rust is just falling off into our foil container. So I think, unfortunately, this pump is toast. But looking at it, I mean, it'd be nice if I could actually fix it, but it's all kind of pressed together. might be quite fiddly, and even if I can get it apart and clean it and things, I'm not sure I can get it back together again and have it working. And really, you want this to be super reliable, so I think, unfortunately, I need to replace this with a brand new one. So we've got a brand new fuel pump, but unfortunately the tank is still in a bit of a state, and through the fuel pump hole I can actually see the sort of the rod and the float for the fuel gauge, and that's looking quite corroded. I can see a couple of baffles and they're also looking a little bit corroded. But I really want to know whether our Range Rover is going to go, and whether this problem at least has been solved. I'm going to pop this into the tank and then just move the tank nearer the vehicle, plumb it in, and also connect it up with the wiring and just see if it actually works. Right then, so I've now got our fuel pump in the fuel tank, which is outside the vehicle. It's plumbed in, it's connected up to the electrics, so when I crank it over now, I'm hoping I'm going to see some fuel come out of that hose. So it might take a while just to bring it all the way through. Oh, there we go, fantastic. So, oh my word, right, brilliant. I'm just going to reconnect that hose. Now we know we have fuel, that's wonderful. Obviously it's under pressure, so it's good to have a proper seal on it. Okay, let's go again. Oh, here we go, this is the big one. Hang on, I can hear fuel, I can hear fuel. Oh, this isn't good. Oh man, I was so close. There really is only one thing one can do in this situation. Well, while I have a cup, I thought I'd answer some of your questions. Now, the first one is from Trevor Clutterbuck. Hi Ed, I know it's a long shot, but I brought a new T5, which my mum helped me to get and was hoping to get finished before she passed away. But unfortunately, she now only has days left, and I would like to get my van done so I can take my mum's ashes in the van. I need an engine swap and a few other bits. Just wondering if you could point me in the right direction. Well, Trevor, really sorry to hear about your mum, but I do think we might be able to help you out, because I've got a friend called Dan who's got a mate with a T5 project that he's no longer working on. He's got a spare engine that he has actually got up for sale, and it might be just what you need for your van. Only thing is, there are a few checks we need to make before we can actually go for that deal. Basically, you need to make sure that the years are pretty close. You need to make sure that the engine spec is identical, ideally, because I'll tell you a story about this particular one. I once kind of had to swap the body of the van on this particular van, and so I kept all the running gear, but actually swapped out the body, and my original van was kind of like a lower base model spec, whereas this van has actually got a bit more luxury attached to it. So mechanically, all of the parts fitted. It was very easy to swap over, but unfortunately, even though they were 1 year out, the wiring was an absolute nightmare. There were loads of wires, all the same color, but going to different parts of that wiring circuit. So it took a long time to get it all to work. But now I've got electric windows and air conditioning, so it was worth the effort. So definitely we can hook you up with Dan and his mate and to see if we can get some kind of deal going there for you, but obviously make sure you do all your checks first. Now, while we're actually in front of the van, another question we've had in from Dave. Now, Dave, so I don't know if you're going to see this, but knowing you love VWs, I wish you could help with mine. He's got a 2003 Beetle. The brakes have got me beat, apparently. he's been told that the ABS system needs bleeding with the VCDS, which is the software from Volkswagen themselves, and he can't afford that, and it's his pride and joy, and he's stuck. Well, actually, I had a very similar problem with this van. The ABS brain just basically stopped working. It was very, very corroded. I took it apart to see if I could fix any parts on it, and really, it just needed to be replaced. But before I actually got the new one, I very foolishly, in a fit of tidiness, threw away the old one before I'd taken the code off the ABS brain itself. Now that meant I had to go to Volkswagen. I couldn't just use a proprietary bit of hardware to actually fix the problem. And of course, as part of the bleeding system, it actually goes through a special sequence, which only happens on the VCDS system. And as it turned out, it's actually a very simple job once you've got it on the ramp, and took less than an hour. So it cost me just £60. So even though it's a chunk of money, obviously it's the brakes we're talking about, but it's going to mean that your pride and joy will be back on the road in no time. A couple of years ago, I met self-confessed superfan Howard and his lovely wife Mari when they came all the way to Vegas to visit me while I was at the SEMA show. Now, he was telling me all about his fantastic Beetle project, and he's now got heavily involved in the bodywork and has a question.
Hey Ed, it's your friend Howard from across the pond. The current project is a 1968 convertible Beetle. So far, the only problem I'm seeing at the moment is that when the measurements are correct with the old one, as you can see, the holes in there are off center a little bit. Then we've got this little bit of meat out here on the outside edge, and it's the same over here. I think I can wallow those holes out a bit and make them, align them more straight up and down. But the other problem, which I'm not sure at the moment what I'm going to do about, is this gap under here. Because it seems to me that this nap pad is not deep enough to go down and sit flush where it's supposed to on this bottom plate. So my question is going to be, are they going to come up and sandwich and be slightly up like a couple of wings on both sides? Or is there something else I can do up here in this area to get it to lay down a little further? And I thought, since you were a fellow air-cooled VW enthusiast, and with all the experience you've had with them, that you could help me with my question for today.
Well, Howard, it's great that you're being brave enough to get so involved in your bug. Now, the thing is, there are a couple of things you need to worry about. Essentially, the main thing is just measure and remeasure a number of times and only weld the once and not have to cut all kinds of stuff out, because that will be a real pain. Now, there are two things I guess you need to be thinking about at the same time. So once you've finished all your welding and stuff, and I would definitely just tack it all in place at first, and then make sure, actually offer it up to the body again, just to make sure that the profile of your tunnel and your new frame head actually then match the underside of the bug body. The other thing I want to think about is actually a bit more important perhaps, because it's all about the steering geometry. Now, I know this is a beach buggy rather than a Beetle, and of course it's not even all there, but it should give you a good idea. Now, the main thing I'm worried about is when you're doing kind of the work on the sort of the front here, obviously you could get it at maybe half a mil, quarter of a mil out, or I suppose a fraction of an inch, should we say, because we're basically doing it in America. But when that's going on, of course, a little error here can be a much bigger error on the outside of the vehicle. And the reason that matters is when you think the front beam is going to be bolted onto the bit that you're now welding up, and obviously if it's slightly out, it could mean that then the front axle actually becomes slightly skew-if. So it's going to be either too long or too short a distance from the back axle. It's absolutely critical that you find a way of, first of all, measuring the distance from the front axle to the rear on both sides, make sure that they are the same. Also measure it across diagonally on both ways as well, so you know it's all square. And it doesn't really matter whether you use the beam or some tubes to represent the beam, but as long as you can find a way to kind of lock it all in position before you start welding up, then that way you will avoid your car sort of crabbing down the road. Because even though, of course, you can steer to go straight again, it would be much better if it went dead straight rather than slightly sideways. Now, interestingly, even if you get those distances exactly the same on both sides and diagonally, it doesn't actually matter if it's slightly longer or slightly shorter. I mean, we're talking sort of millimeters again, or thou again, because obviously when you think about a beach buggy, they're radically shortened often, and of course they're fine as long as they're all square. So the thing about it is, as long as you're not crabbing, it's all good. But I think obviously, ideally, again, just do it again and again, keep nibbling bits away, and then don't be worried about cutting into brand new panels, because ultimately when they come out of the factory, especially if they're pattern parts, they might be ever so slightly squiffy, they might need a bit of work anyway. So really just go to town on it, but just try and give yourself as much reference point as you can before you actually commit to the weld. Good luck, and let us know how you get on. got a couple of questions here on much the same sort of subject. The first one is from Ian Rowley. He says, Ed, could you show us how to change the engine in a small car to an electric motor? We've got another question here from PC Fronin. Is there more of a tech build of the motor and running gear coming later? And of course that was to do with the Guinness World Records video about my world's fastest all-electric ice cream van record attempt. We've actually had loads of questions on this subject. You guys want to know exactly what I did and all the technical detail, so we're going to give you the whole story from start to finish. But first, it's bedtime. Now, way back in 1998, I think it was, I got my first Guinness World Record. It was in the driving sofa that you will know about, and we got clocked at doing 87 miles an hour on the start-finish straight. It was a real honour to actually get into the book. But the funny thing is, once you've got one record, it's not quite enough. So, of course, had the world's fastest bed, the world's fastest bathroom, world's fastest shed, world's fastest office, even the world's largest motorised shopping trolley. So it just kind of kept on going. So a few years forward, like 2018, Guinness got in touch and said, what should we do this year? And we were talking about all kinds of records we could do. And they suddenly went, why not do an ice cream van? Why don't we go electric? So that sort of course was set. But then I suddenly realised, having agreed to this, that obviously I couldn't just electrify the ice cream van, I also had to then electrify the ice cream machine inside, and that is where this mission started. Now, of course, the first thing I needed when I'm doing my ice cream van project is an ice cream van, and the obvious place to start was with Whitby Morrison. So they've been doing it a very long time, and they've positioned themselves as major players in the industry, and they even have a little museum of lots of old ice cream vans. So I went there. It was really fun having a look at all of these different types of ice cream vans, but I really love the lines and the curves, all the sort of 50s and 60s vans. They're just so cute and cuddly and whatever, but obviously when you look at some of these older vans, they're full of rust, they're full of repairs and stuff, and I had a mission. I had to get this thing electric as soon as possible. So in the end, Whitby agreed to actually lend me one of their vans so I could do the conversion to that. Finally, a brand new ice cream van arrived at the workshop. Well, this is it. I have found my project vehicle. It's a very special ice cream van as well, because this is the Whitby Morrison development prototype for their new body design, the Amalfi. The question is, what was I going to do with it? So, where are the batteries going to go? Where's the motor going to go? What bits am I going to take out? What bits are going to stay there? Now, after all, the lighter it is, the faster it's going to go. Now, something I must always keep in mind with this project is I am trying to get an official Guinness World Record, and because of that, there are rules I have to comply with. Now, the obvious one, obviously, it has to be a working ice cream van, but there are quite lots of little details as part of that. You've got to have chimes, it's got to sound like an ice cream van. You've got to have the little stickers on the window that tell you what the prices are. I've got to be able to achieve 70 miles an hour, and bear in mind that the street legal speed limit of an ice cream van is actually 60, so it's already quite a challenge, but probably the most obvious thing, the main thing, is I need to be able to make fresh ice cream. And that means I need to have an ice cream machine that will be driven electrically, and I need to be able to produce ice cream before and after my speed run, just to prove that it really works. So that is going to be quite a challenge. Well, that's it. I've now managed to remove everything I don't need from my ice cream van, the engine, the fuel tank and everything else. I now need to think about everything that's going to go back in the electric drivetrain. How is it going to fit? Where am I going to store everything? And how am I going to make it go fast enough to actually set the world record? Well, that was a ton of work, but actually it turned out to be the easiest part of the project. But anyway, join me next time, and I promise I'll get out of bed.